Hello, welcome back to Globe Summit. We're so happy that you could join us for this conversation. My name is Isaac Fitzgerald, and I'm here to welcome the incredible author, Nicole Treska, whose new book, Wonderland, is absolutely fantastic. Nicole, how you doing?
Hi, Isaac. Thank you so much, and thank you for talking to me today. I'm doing great.
It's so great to be here in Boston with you.
To meet you in person.
First
at the
time.
Harvard Club.
I'm a big fan of the book. I blurbed it. I love it. I'm very stoked to be here with you.
Me too.
I've heard you're a hell of a reader, though. I've heard you really give a good reading. So
I like that.
Before we jump into the conversation,
yes,
could I ask you just to read a little bit from the book?
I brought the book. I will read a little bit.
Thank you.
I'm going to read just a page and a half or so that I think gives a sense of what the book is about and is very Boston-centric.
Fantastic.
To the Treska family, gangs were benevolent. What was there to say? Criminals ran Boston. There were only so many paths a person could take on this earth and in that town, so what was wrong with a little money and security? And not for nothing, but if you ran the numbers, you'd find yourself with a pretty strong argument regarding the pursuit of criminal pursuits in America. To be in a gang was to be respected and feared, to be legitimized. There was nothing petty about the mob, nothing poor. My family members were bit parts in a bigger picture, walk-ons, supporting cast, but they'd be the first to tell you they were in the shot. Our pedigree was proxy, 1 degree removed from first. My parents knew who buried the bodies, and that knowing was currency to many in Boston, a passport through a world with tight borders. That said, I think I know what my papa couldn't know until his heart exploded in the hallway on Hancock Street. The Winter Hill Gang giveth, the Winter Hill Gang taketh away. All our Treska lives and deaths were caught up in the gang's long reach. The diner burned to the ground after my papa died in 1987. My Uncle Bobby locked up and strolled across the street to the hardware store. By the time he came out, the diner was engulfed, oranges and reds sky high. Nothing he could do about it, he said.
I'm just going to clap.
Thank
Feel free
you.
to clap at home.
Thank
nicely
you.
done, nicely done.
Keeping it short.
So let's just open with that, because what
Yes.
an enticing read. For those that aren't familiar with the book, could you just walk us through a little bit of the background, your family story, obviously the connection there,
Yes.
and then kind of what you go on to do?
Yeah, so the book is about me, and I think some people think it's about the mob, and it is actually about my life and my father's relationship to the Winter Hill Gang. When we were young, he was a bookie, and then he went to prison for federal drug trafficking in 1986, I think. And that was all very, like I said in the reading, low-level involvement, but that involvement went on to lead to his prison time. My uncle overdosed of a heroin addiction. My aunt was schizophrenic. So, that didn't have to do with the mob, but it was certainly exacerbated by her relationships when she was young. So I think, the backstory is my family had a lot of criminal entanglements, and then the front story is how do you live an adult life with that background. I know this is like when you are from a working class family that has, been incarcerated and struggled with drug addiction and mental health, going to grad school for an MFA in writing is wild. Mm-hmm. So sort of writing those two things and figuring out how to, see my family and forgive them, I think, and not even that they need it, but just see them whole was a point I was trying to make for myself. I think, in the book.
For yourself and for the reader and,
and
the people that
and
they
their
were.
Families.
Well, and let's talk a little bit about that, because that little section that you read from, I loved. It talks about, there was nothing poor.
Yeah.
There was nothing that made it a certain seriousness. There was a certain, gravitas to that kind of association. And you yourself, right? A love of books, an aspiration, like you just talked about, going to a graduate school. Do you see maybe some similarity between these types of drive, obviously playing out on two very different sides of the law?
Totally. I mean, I think it's the hustle, right? It's the hustling hard of desire that I think is like my people are filled with desire, even if they can't get where they want to go all the time. So I feel like that drove my own ambitions. And I think the way I saw it in the book was shaded by the class I want to, right? Like I always wanted to be in rooms like this, in neighborhoods
Hardwood.
like this. And I think to my family, they were always like, who is this kid? And like, who does she, this is like a refrain in the book, who does she think she is? So I do think that I have the same thing as them, absolutely, but I've applied it in this way that like baffles everybody.
No, but that's exactly right. And I think that's a very common, especially people from the New England area can relate to kind of who do you think you are? Also, like Adam Sandler, to give it a throwback to a local hero. Like they're all gonna laugh at you, which is like early kind of thing. It's like you said, it's very much a story of your roots, but it is also a story about growth and in a way, getting out, breaking through, and that's obviously the theme of Globe Summit, breakthroughs. Could you talk about how this area kind of affects you as an artist today, or what you still carry with you? Because a lot of the book is, right, you're in Hawaii, you travel around, you move to different places, but kind of how you carry this place in you.
That's a great question, and one that I feel as soon as I land. I walk out, I'm like, smells like Boston. I'm like on the Charles watching the geese, and I'm like, geese. So it's like, the things that
somebody knocks into you, and it's like, where are you going? And you're like, all right, perfect.
Hey, friends,
welcome.
Just very excited. So I think the place itself is very it surprises me with how powerfully attracted I am to it. When I am home, I feel very, very home in a way that I don't know that I feel home in Denver or that I feel home in Honolulu. I do feel home in New York. So I feel like that part of Boston is innate. And then in the way it affects my art, I think class has a lot of the class lessons I grew up with have lingered into our lives in New York, which are very, very different than Boston, and trying to kind of work my way through that.
Can you talk a little, like classes in unions, classes in solidarity?
I was an adjunct for 15 years. I was waitressing and adjuncting in New York, part of a union that I loved, but was more concerned with full-time faculty than even within the union. I was like, we're pretty at the bottom of this barrel. So I feel like I've always existed in the working class world, even when I've lived in New York and Honolulu, very expensive places. And so my eye tends to be with the working class. I feel like, and then in New York, you're surrounded, and I write about this in the book, and I'm sure in Boston as well, you're surrounded by people with a lot of money who are like, I don't have that much money. And then you show up at their house and you're like, that house is enormous. What do you mean? So I feel like I'm always sort of tricked into thinking everybody comes from the same background as I do.
And they actually come from very, very different.
Very, very different backgrounds.
That's exactly right. So what would your advice be for someone who's maybe watching this and not even just locale-based, but just is maybe a little bit interested in breaking out? And a two-part question, what would you say to them also about coming back?
I think that we come from a very sort of tribal, New England is a very tribal place, and we are all very identity-based, and leaving that can be really frightening because a lot of the times you get those questions, like, who do you think you are? But I think what is frightening is often great. Feel the fear and do it anyway was the name of an anti-anxiety book I read a lot. And I think that I would say, go toward fear as a general rule, not maybe bear fear, but existential fear. And then coming home, I think, is inevitable. And impossible, but inevitable, I think, in the sense that if you go away and you come back to Boston 10 years later, it's still your town. Even though this town is not my town anymore, it's still my town. So it's that was actually a lesson I just learned since the book came out, because I haven't been home in a long time. So that's a thumbs up for leaving, because you can't come home again, Isaac.
It is still here. I'm with you. I was just walking around this neighborhood myself and remembering what it was like in the 80s when I was a child. What part of coming home for you do you find, you just said you can't come home, but you can, it is here. You said you haven't been here in a long time. is there something surprising about it to you? Is there something refreshing? Like, if you were offered a teaching gig around here, would you?
Oh, I would take it in a minute. I would. I would come home. Like, part of the book is, about my frustration at my father selling our home in Somerville.
That's right.
Between my cousins and my sister and myself when we were young. And I always was like, we could just live in Boston. Like, we could have a house in Boston. So I think it's a new version of my town and your town that we grew up in. And I think it's actually closer to the one we live in now in New York, where there is, like, my publicist lived in East Boston. And I was like, that's crazy. Why are you living in East? But then I realized people are moving to East Boston to work in the city. So I feel like it's become a place that is sort of both of my lives.
Yeah.
I think it's always been that, but maybe I feel the most.
Because you carry it with you.
Yeah.
You carry those memories. No, I understand completely. After growing up in Boston, I lived in North Central Massachusetts.
Yeah.
And Boston seems so far away.
Right.
And now they're just people that live there and commute. And that's exactly like the world has, in a way, gotten smaller. I don't know if that's I've gotten older and things have changed.
I think it's both.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So I want to ask a quick question from the audience that
fine.
we have here. And thank you so much to everyone who's submitting questions and watching along. When did you know you wanted to write the book? Which is a different question than the second, which I love, which is, and what pushed you to actually start?
Oh, that's a great question.
Yeah.
That's a great question because there is an explicit answer. I think I knew I wanted to write the book since probably 2006 or 7 when I moved toward moving to New York, and I realized my auntie was living in a mental institution at that point, and I just didn't want her life. I wanted people to know she had a life and not reached her 70s and died alone in an asylum. And I was like, I just want people to know about my Auntie Loretta. So I think that was sort of the impetus. And then how I actually was pushed to write it was in 2020, a little something happened. And my agent was like, Annie DeWitt, who I love, was like, you sit down and write everything you ever told me about your father every time we go out for dinner. Because I would just sit down and be like, you are never going to believe what Phil did to me today. And she was like, just write 200 pages of that, and we'll go from there. And that was very much what became this book.
Can you share one of the stories that you knew you absolutely had to include in that? And then also maybe walk us through what that process is, because I think a lot of people, especially those interested in maybe writing about their own story, are like, but how do I select what stories to keep in and what stories to leave?
I don't think we know. I don't know if you had this experience with the memoir, but you're like, is that enough? Is this too much? Is this important? Is that important? Because it all feels important and it all feels relevant. And I think... and
it also feels, who do you think you are?
Yeah, and I was going to say, and like kind of dumb. Like, does anybody want to know about this?
Yeah.
So I think it's this, the writing of it was by far the most frustrating part for me, but I mean, I guess for anybody, but because I didn't know what the shape of it was. And then my editor was Yadon Israel, who's wonderful, was very, very helpful in being like, I don't know if you need this. And once I saw the shape, it became a lot easier. What was the first half of that?
No, that's absolutely all right. It was just like, what caused you to want to write the story, and then what pushed you to actually like sit down and start on it?
Yeah, I think that was it. I think I got that.
Do you what was the shape that emerged that made it easier?
It was present me in the world. And something that Yadon brought up was, you're not in this book, it's you talking about your family. It's your family's book, but it's your memoir, and you're on the cover, and you're on the back cover, and it was this kind of revelatory thing. I think growing up as the eldest daughter of, working class immigrant background became about me being in the book. That became about like me being a person in my own family, and like a sense of myself where I was like, oh my God, I don't even exist in this spectrum of my life. I'm sitting here and talking about like, have you seen what my mom did? Have I told you about what my dad did? And it was sort of revelatory in that regard. So I think once I focused on myself, a lot of the relationships to my family and the past and the city became like so much more clear.
Do you think that was also a moment of self-discovery, even stepping away from the art, just in seeing yourself on your own?
It was enormous. I was like going through therapy while I was writing the book, and my therapist was like, "Seems like you're doing a lot of work here." And I was like, "I am just trying to meet deadline." But what that work meant was like the edits were really intense about figuring out my own life, because we're writing memoirs. Like you're like, "Oh, is that what that's about?" And what you're talking about is like you.
And putting yourself out there and being vulnerable in that way. I want to ask you a question about that vulnerability, but first, I did also remember I was asking what story.
Yes,
you were correct. What story about your dad really pushed you over the edge?
Yes.
You're like,
all right, and I'm glad we came back to this because this is ridiculous. It is in the book. During this time, he came from, he was actually in Boston at the Leahy Clinic, where he goes. And he'd come to New York, and he got to my house, and he asked if there was any food, and I said, no, but I can order you some. And he said, don't worry about me, I'm fine. And then 3 hours later, I got home, and he had dug through every drawer and cabinet until he hit the weed brownies in the back of the freezer that were like so strong. I was like hiding them from anybody. I was like, these are dangerous. And he had eaten 3. That's enough to like take down a large animal. Like he was like, he was like, do you think people can change? He like sort of, he sort of created the theme of the book, which is like, can people change? And it's a thing that Phil, into his 70s, my father is Phil, is still very concerned with, and I love him for that. I think if you're an old man being like, can I be a better person? Then that's like, you've nailed something.
But again, and that's also a theme in your book, like you just said, and it shows up and that story's in there, but it's this idea of reconnecting with who we came from and finding out that we're maybe more like our family than we first think. Totally. And we're going to run into, in a way, their same troubles. But at the same time, can we change and not just change ourselves, but maybe the direction of our family. I've got one more here from the audience, but before I do, I'm being greedy because it's just fun to talk to you. I want to ask one quick question about, for me, I mean, writing can be such an arduous process. It's very difficult. And so I feel like people are usually pushed to do it because they see a hole in the literary landscape. So one, I wanted to ask you, was there a hole in the literary landscape that you were looking to fill? And second, no pun intended. And second, what books did you see your book in conversation with? So kind of what was already out there that you feel like you're becoming part of, and what were you looking to fill?
Your book was one that I'd read, not to be like, gas them up, but it was very true. And I read it and I thought, oh, there's like a way, this is actually the structure I'm gonna be able to use. It didn't turn out to be that, but I felt like so much clarity in having read your memoir. I also read a lot of, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. I don't know that is in conversation with my book, but language-wise, I read a lot of Toni Morrison because just hearing her voice in my head has always been great. I read Hua Hasu's, what was it, Stay True?
Yep.
Incredible. Chloe's Easy Beauty were books. A lot of contemporary memoirs. Safia Sinclair, whose book came out while I was in edits, and she also blurbed the book, and I was like, oh my God, she's like incredible. So I feel like there's been a lot of really great memoir in the last couple of years to pull from. And in terms of a hole that I thought the book might be trying to fill, I studied with Gordon Lish and he's been a mentor for years. And Mitchell Jackson and Kimberly King Parsons, I feel less of a hole and more of like, I want to be writing toward my cohort of writers that I've been with for a decade, that I love their work and I admire them so much. So I feel like I wasn't trying to fill anything. I was just like chasing my cool friends.
And making a place for yourself on the shelf, which I love. All right, so we're gonna end with this question from the audience, which again, thank you all so much for joining us. But was there any story or detail you had to take out in the editing process that you loved and would want to share, and I'm going to put an asterisk on it, and that you can share publicly because your family might watch this?
Yes, thank you. Hello, family. There were actually several. There were a few that I had to take out because they involved like insurance fraud, and I was like, I don't think I need.
You're like, what's the? How many years have to pass?
Are these live? So there were a few cases like that, but then there was a lot that just didn't fit in. That's a really good question. One of them was this very seminal moment where my father was was boxing at the Huntington Y. He used to box there all the time, and he had lost this enormous match. And my papa was so proud of him, and my dad was like, I'm a loser, and never fought again. And I always thought he sort of missed the whole point of that, which is that he'd done so well and his dad loved him, but all he could think about was like, I didn't win that big fight. And I just thought there was a lot about my dad in that.
Yeah, it's a hypercritical voice that I think a lot of us have.
Yeah, we got it.
But I'm glad you got past it to write this wonderful memoir. Thank you for talking with us, Nicole. Everyone, if you haven't read it yet, go get Wonderland. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.